Hey, Abby, here's what my plan is for the classes that you miss. Is I'll put together these slides and try to cover, as best I can what we covered in class. Um, so this will pick up basically from the midterm. Uh, I think what happened, if memory serves, we took the midterm right before the fall break, and you've got yours. I can't link to Google stuff for whatever reason. Maybe I'm just not smart enough. But so if you can send that back and just as a Word document or some way get it back to me, we'll get that figured out. But because of, there's a couple classes that got delayed, some things happened with the school shutting down for a little bit. The quiz 4 really covers from the 20s, chapter 24 through 26. So it's a little bit bigger block, but the bulk of it's off of 25, 26. So what I would do, all the chapter slides are still in Blackboard, just like always. So I would go over the slides from 24, but for 25, 26, there's some concepts in here that the slides I don't think would clearly illustrate. So I'll step through those. So again, these slides are in Blackboard as well. So at some point this week, this being the Wednesday the 28th, I'll send you quiz 4. And again, just do that through email, really, and send it back to me, and that'll keep us rolling forward. And so from 26, once we get done with that, 27 we get to World War II, and there's really only about 5 chapters left in the semester. So I'll probably bunch them together. World War II may be its own video, but do maybe 2 chapters at a time to keep you up with what we're doing in class. All right. So that said, let's just jump in, and I'll just try to hit the highlights. I keep these to about, I'd say 45 minutes, but I tend to talk too much, so maybe an hour or so. So here we are talking about the Great Depression and then the outcome of the Great Depression, what Franklin Roosevelt calls the New Deal. What are we going to do to try to fix this problem? Okay? And something to remember, we talk about the Great Depression and we focus on it as an American phenomenon. Certainly we suffered through it, but the Great Depression was really more of a worldwide phenomenon, and it hit Germany extremely hard with the results from the Treaty of Versailles and them having to at least notionally repay all the debt for the death and destruction of World War I. Okay? And that has some impacts on how World War II is going to develop. Right, so a couple reviews that'll help kind of catch up the 24 piece. There was an idea in that where people oppose war. There's always some group out there, it doesn't matter what it is, Desert Storm, Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, there's going to be people who oppose war. And in general, socialists or people that lean toward that socialist perspective tend to disagree with the idea of war. And the reason why is very often those who fight the war are the lower stratum of society. And so this quote, rich man's war but a poor man's fight, that really comes even back from the Civil War. Because in the Civil War you could buy your way out of having to fight, right? $200, and you could hire somebody else to fight for you, for the Union at least. And so you hear that again in World War I. We're going to hear it again, especially in Vietnam. So the war, 1914 to 1918, the U.S. gets in on the tail end of it, right, the last year or so, and is pivotal in pushing the Allies, the Entente countries, over the edge to victory. During that time, though, you saw in the U.S., leading up to World War I, there was a lot of strikes, there was a lot of resistance to big companies, poor working conditions, long work days, work weeks, unsafe. And so there was a lot of strikes going on to try to redress the balance of power between business owners and the workers. During the war, you don't see that because going on strike while the country's at war comes across as very unpatriotic, especially if that industry supports the war effort. And so all of that angst is kind of put on hold in support of the U.S. entry into the World War I. But so we come back to 1919, all of those issues are still there. And so 1919 becomes known as the year of strikes, up to the point that I think it was Boston police department went on strike. And so that's why, is that built up anger, frustration with working conditions. So you see a lot of strikes through the 1919s, even 1920s. You see a lot of race riots, and we see a dramatic increase in lynching, and not confined to the South. It was on a national level. And why? Because we're in the midst of, again, the war is over. Now we kind of reattack the beginnings of a civil rights movement. And so you have that of minorities, of the freed blacks from after the Civil War fighting for their rights. And you see what's known as the Great Migration. And you see a lot of these freed slaves coming north to find work, because the North, the Rust Belt, right, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, that area, is full of industry, i.e. full of jobs. And so you see freed slaves trying to move north and get those jobs. So that's why it wasn't just a Southern phenomenon. And people coming to take your job, especially if you think they're going to work for less money, is very frightening to those in those jobs. And I don't care if it's freed slaves or immigrants coming from Italy or Ireland. There's resistance to that. We'll skip WASP. If you know what that is, White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, it was kind of the idea that we know best, we being that group. And then the idea of prohibition, right? The idea that it had been around for a while, that alcohol is bad, and it's especially bad for that lower stratum, the socioeconomic stratum of our culture, that the poor drink the most, and it's the worst for them. And so that gains traction through the progressive era, to the point that, yeah, the same time we get women's right to vote, the 19th Amendment, we as a country also passed prohibition. Thou shalt not drink. Was it doomed from the outset? I think the answer is yes, because if a culture wants something, somebody's going to find a way of supplying that demand. And you could look at the same thing with the war on drugs, right? If people want weed, there's going to be some way of getting it. But there was enough push from the progressives on prohibition to kind of clean up society that it was actually passed as the 18th Amendment. And now that only lasts about 13 years, because in the midst of a Great Depression, people look around and go, one, Al Capone and his ilk are still supplying alcohol. There's speakeasies, right? The Great Gatsby idea. And if it's in a depression, it's nice to have an escape, right? And so the 21st Amendment in 1933 says, you know what, that was a terrible idea, and repeals the 18th Amendment. So that's a little bit of a review. As we move into this time frame, this idea of the worst president, I mean, that's always debatable. I would argue that probably James Buchanan, the guy that was in just before Abraham Lincoln, the 15th president, who really let the country devolve into the point of civil war, was probably the worst. But this guy, Warren Harding, he's like one of those guys that just wants to be kind of friends with everyone, right? Too eager to say yes. And he surrounds himself, because he's somewhat naive, with really criminals and cronies in his administration. And some of them end up going to jail, which sounds a little bit familiar with today as well. One of the biggest scandals was this Teapot Dome scandal. Had to do with drilling for oil in an area known as the Teapot Dome. And he allowed some of his cronies to influence the drilling of, and they investigated the leases into drilling in that area. And his interior secretary is convicted of accepting bribes. So that's a black mark, not only on Albert Fall, but certainly on Harding as the president for letting this happen. Okay, first president cabinet member to go to prison. Now we've gotten a few more, haven't we? No one was convicted of paying bribes. But it really hurts the administration. And so what you see is, something like this may preclude re-election. And so add that to some strikes with the railroads, talking about those, built up desire for striking, vetoing this bill, the bonus bill. It doesn't matter what it is, but these are unpopular. And so he's kind of cast his lot that re-election is going to be difficult, if not impossible. A few good things he did, though. We tend to throw, People think of Richard Nixon, what a terrible president, right? Watergate. But there were some things Nixon did, like starting the Environmental Protection Agency. So sometimes we forget the good. And here's a little bit of Harding's, right? He starts with U.S. Steel, Carnegie's monopoly, his trust, working for an 8-hour workday to try to help working conditions. And really, that's kind of become the norm. Not only an 8-hour workday, but now we have a typically 5-day work week. He also tried to push this idea that, we look at World War I and what happened. If we go back to that acronym MAIN, militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism, that part of that, the militarism, was this arms race between especially European countries. And so if we can preclude that from happening, if we can get major, and it's focused on the Navy, because honestly, even today, the Navy is probably the most important arm of the military, because it's very mobile. But if we can limit the size of the fleets, and this focuses back on Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, that we may be able to help preclude another big war. But if you look at that list, U.S., Japan, Britain, France, Italy, who's missing? One is Russia, but the other is Germany. And maybe Germany's missing because the Treaty of Versailles said very clearly you will not have an air force. You can have a navy, but it's 6 ships and no submarines. And you can have, it's 100,000 man, really a self-defense force as opposed to an army. So people think during this time frame, well, we don't really need anything more on Germany to stop them from building up. And of course Hitler, when he comes to power, goes around all the elements of the Treaty of Versailles and violates them and builds a really powerful military. And we're going to see this guy again, so that's why I bring him up. His Secretary of Commerce, this guy Herbert Hoover, smart and efficient, yes, on the economic side, but he grows up under the influence of that social Darwinism, that if you're wealthy, you're a good person. If you're poor, there's probably something wrong with you. You have some kind of failing. And that's going to influence him as we get into the Great Depression. So next comes what the guy called Silent Cal, Calvin Coolidge. And I throw this picture up in the class, and it's almost immediate. Everybody looks at it and goes, he's in a 3-piece suit plowing this field. He was kind of a strange bird, but the nickname Silent Cal, he didn't do a lot of talking. He didn't open his yap all the time. So I throw up a few of his quotes. I kind of like these, right? It's like the idea, if you don't tell lies, you don't have to remember what you lied about. It'd be nice if some in Washington portrayed these a little bit more. Great man to be a good listener. The bottom one, 4/5 of all our trouble would disappear if we would just shut up. Maybe. But you get the idea. He was a kind of not a background president, but he let other people kind of take the lead. And one of those was his economic advisor, a guy named Mellon. Proper, even dreary. That's why I use that picture. You saw how proper he was. He was wearing a suit. Able to make speeches, but that underlined piece, willing for business to take the lead. And we're going to see this kind of first iteration of a thing called trickle-down economics. And so Mellon, and there's a bank still named after him, Mellon Bank, Carnegie Mellon Bank, says growth is dependent on capitalists reinvesting. So he lowers taxes on the rich. And this idea has been tried at least 3 times. One here with Coolidge, a second time with Ronald Reagan in the 80s, and then again under Trump. And believing that if we cut taxes on the rich, they'll expand, there'll be more jobs, the so-called job creators, and that investment will trickle down onto us poor, washed, working class, the masses. And it's never worked. And that video, and I actually didn't play this in class, but you can try it. The Blue Star video goes to an explanation by an economist of why trickle-down economics doesn't and has never and probably will never work. But that's part of his policy, right? So cutting taxes on the rich. So we're starting to set the stage a little bit for what's coming with the Great Depression, that final straw, the stock market collapse. At the same time, just up the road here in Dayton, Tennessee, you have this very famous Scopes so-called monkey trial. And just some of the background behind it, you may know more, some about it as well. But it was really talking about evolution, right? That's where the monkey trial comes in. So this poor guy, John Scopes, he was a substitute teacher. And he talked a little bit about the idea of evolution, which was gaining some traction. Um, and that was against the law at the time. Because in Tennessee, that act said, if it's a state-funded school, you will only teach creation, not evolution. And he did. And, when you read about it in depth, it wasn't like he was trying to convince anybody. He just brought it up as a food for thought almost idea. And so going against that Butler Act and going against the literal truth of the Bible, there's a trial over this. And so it becomes kind of the O.J. Simpson trial of the 1920s. So you have our friend William Jennings Bryan, who's run for president more than a couple times and lost each time, against Clarence Darrow. And you can see which side they both go to. And that's why Bryan College is named Bryan College, for William Jennings Bryan, the big statue of him on the campus. Darrow ends up kind of winning the case, if you can call it that, but the outcome is sort of pathetic in a way. So they find Scopes guilty, they fine him $100, and that's eventually overturned. So there's no real outcome beyond the media circus that descends on Dayton, Tennessee, and all the people there watching. And so here's a picture of Bryan on the right, Darrow on the left. And again, whenever I throw pictures in class, what do you see? Well, you notice Darrow's got a cigarette. It's like old movies. You go to watch old movies. It's like everybody's smoking in the movies. You see Bryan with a fan, right? Because we're talking about Tennessee in the summer with no air conditioning. So I'm sure it was quite warm. A little stare down going on, but they don't seem overly antagonistic. And this, if you've ever seen the movie To Kill a Mockingbird, this little girl in the background watching, she reminds me of Scout in that movie for some reason. Right? Okay, and this one, again, you're welcome to watch it. I didn't play it. It's a long video, and it's sort of odd in its presentation. But it comes from a series, it's from England, but it's called The Century of the Self. And it has to do with how we become more and more enamored with self-gratification over time. And so the first part of the video talks about this guy named Edward Bernays. And Bernays was a student, probably the best student, of a guy named George Creel. And they both kind of broke the code on propaganda. And so Bernays was the cousin of Sigmund Freud. And so he got a copy of Freud's book on psychoanalysis. And he looked into it. And he used some of that to build some slogans that supported World War I, the war to end all wars, the war to make the world safe for democracy, right? To tell the American people, we're going to send our boys over to Europe to fight to reestablish the old monarchies. That wasn't going to fly. So he had to come up with something new, the war to end all wars. That sounds great, right? Make the world safe for democracy. That sounds great. And so what happens is Bernays actually travels with Woodrow Wilson and the coalition to the Treaty of Versailles. And when he gets to France, he's like, holy moly, because the French people just mob Woodrow Wilson like he's some kind of peacemaker, almost godlike. And Bernays looks at that and he goes, man, if I can influence people in wartime with my propaganda, what can I do in peacetime? Okay? And he comes up with this, what makes us docile? The word docile meant pliable, right? Able to manipulate. And so he comes up with an experiment, and he does it with women and smoking. And you saw in that picture, Clarence Darrow smoking, men smoking, that was kind of the thing. But it was a taboo, really, for women, especially younger women, single women, to smoke. And so he goes, I'm going to try something. And he kind of seeds both sides of the argument. On the women's side, there's a big parade in New York, kind of akin to like the Macy's Thanksgiving parade. And he gets a bunch of young suffragettes, women supporting the right to vote. And he has them take cigarettes with him, and they're going to light up during the parade. And then on the other side, he tells the news media, hey, man, I heard that these women are going to light up cigarettes. Oh, my goodness. And so, of course, the news is there, and they report on it. And what he did that was the genius part propaganda-wise was he didn't call them cigarettes, he called them torches of freedom. And so how can you argue with that? Torches of freedom. And so what happens is, yes, the women pull out a pack of cigarettes, or, you know, in the old days they had those kind of folding metal cases, and light up during the parade, and the news is there to report on it. And after that happens, that breaks down that taboo, that wall, and smoking by women goes up dramatically. And it basically opens up another 50% of the population, the adult population, to smoking. And so the tobacco industry loves it. And so what he does, he changes the term propaganda, and he talks about it in this video. He says, you know, propaganda had a bad connotation, and it still does. We tend to think of propaganda as being lying, or at least stretching the truth. So he comes up with the term public relations. And I know you've heard that. Every company out there has a public relations piece to it, or uses a public relations firm. So what that means today is Bernays broke the code. Old advertising was like, here's what our product is, here's what it can do, bam, bam, bam. Kind of dull, but to the point. Whereas his got more toward your psyche. You will feel better, look better, be a better person if you use our product. And so now what he can do with that is change needs, the things I need to survive, change wants rather, into what you think is a need. I want a new car. And you see it today in advertising, right? Yeah, your Kia may get you back and forth to work, but wouldn't you feel better driving a BMW? Okay? And so we get that kind of conflation of wants and needs. If I can make wants into needs, I can sell you stuff. And that's the rise of propaganda on the home front. That's the idea. My head's in the way. Oh well. If I move it down here, it'll get in the way next. It's long, but if you want to watch it, it's pretty fascinating, I think, the video associated with it. But that's the gist of it. And so here's kind of what comes of this. The country's evolving. You know, we'd been a manufacturing company. We had the oil and the steel and the shipping and the rail and all that stuff as the Industrial Revolution, the second wave, really kicks in. But now the country's moving more toward a consumer economy. And this idea of happiness machines, that's us. What can make people happy? If I can make you happy, if I can make you pliable, if I can make you, what was the word on the last thing? Docile, right? If I can do that, I can sell you stuff. And so this consumer-based economy starts to develop to the point that today it's 70% of the overall American economy is us buying stuff, right? And so we spent a good bit of time in the classroom on this, and there's a cycle, and I usually start it with jobs just because it's an easy place to start, but it's a loop. It keeps going. So if we start with jobs, the outcome of that, yes, hopefully it's a career, something you enjoy, something that adds to society. But one of the basic outcomes of having a job is you make some money. Okay, so now I can pay bills, and if I have enough left over, I can go buy some other things. So that money allows for the consumption of goods, whatever it is. You know, paying the bills and then going to buy a new refrigerator. And so if that happens, if consumption increases, then I have to start producing more of whatever the goods are. So you can see how this cycle can go upwards. I call it upwards. It doesn't go in reverse when things are bad, but it'll go downwards. So in a good economy, jobs are out there, people making money, buying more stuff at Walmart, production of whatever that is goes up. That leads to, well, I need more jobs. I need more people building this. And you can see how that would evolve upwards in an expanding economy. But now what happens is as we get into the Great Depression, we start shedding jobs. Or after the mortgage meltdown or the dot-com bubble, you look at any recession, depression in our country's history, jobs take a hit. So what does that mean? There's less people with less money, so there's less consumption. To the point of the Great Depression, it was massive underconsumption. And what does that do? Well, if people aren't buying stuff, then production goes down. And you can see how that cycle can go downwards. Now, you have to get rid of jobs because we're not making as many refrigerators. Less money, less consumption, and it can continue. And when we get to the Great Depression, there's a place FDR decides to attack this cycle, primarily. Okay. The question up here, what can be done to boost this? And there are at least two. There's probably more, but two simple ones. How can I give you more money? How can I give you money you don't have? And the answer is credit. And it's the simplest way to think about it. It's a credit card. Right? I get that credit card all the way up to the limit. So I can kind of boost this economic cycle. Now there's a limit to it. I'm going to hit my credit limit. I got to start paying it back at some point. But that can help. And then on the other piece, this idea of consumption, that's where Bernays and Creel and this idea of making you think you need things. You didn't even know you wanted them 2 weeks ago, but now you have to have them. So advertising can help boost this desire for or consumption. And we see both of those kick in as we're moving through the 20s and toward the Great Depression. What helps boost it? Well, I asked, what is this? And you can probably take a guess. It's a radio. So now we have this new kind of communications device that can get the word out, that can help with this advertising idea. And we're going to see somebody that was really adept and understood the power of radio and communication was FDR, right? So is Adolf Hitler, by the way. So what does this do to advertising? You can put it out there as commercials. And we're going to see the same thing magnified maybe 10 times when we get to the 60s in television, because now I can put pictures with it. And still, I mean, they're everywhere today. And so as we go through this, the roaring 20s, they were roaring. People were having a big time, right? The war's over. Things are good. The economy's doing well. The stock market's going up by leaps and bounds. We've got more consumer goods, more mass production, which means I can afford a radio or a car, which might have been a luxury item not that long ago. Right? Dress, dance, and music. You have the flappers. You got the Great Gatsby idea. And you have the start of women's liberation, right? The right to vote, the flappers, more sexual freedom, smoking, drinking. Drinking is illegal, but we're getting around that, right? Because people want it. And we talked about the smoking thing with Bernays and breaking down that taboo. So the 20s kind of are roaring. And the Blue Star videos, one's about the roaring 20s, one's about, it's a clip from the Great Gatsby. And what it really shows is this thing called speakeasy, right? The kind of bootleg backroom bar, because people were going around the 18th Amendment and ignoring it. And it's a pretty good scene from the Great Gatsby, the new one. So things are going good through the 20s. Yep, talked about that. What else contributes to a good U.S. economy? Well, there's a fair amount of death and destruction in Europe from World War I. Now, it's not as widespread as we're going to see after World War II, but because of that, that opens up markets for American goods. Because if my business and industry, especially on the Western Front, Belgium, France, is wrecked, I've got to get it from somewhere else. And even if I don't get the goods there, maybe I need stuff to rebuild my factories and the like. So that's going well. 28, we're going to see Herbert Hoover. Remember, we saw him before, this smart kind of economic guy, and he's going to end up winning. So what happened is, over time, we went from Lincoln and the Republicans to, there was only one president really through the rest of the 1800s, Grover Cleveland, who was a Democrat. He won, then he lost, and then he won again. But it's not until we get to Woodrow Wilson that we see another Democrat win the White House. And once that's over, we're going to see the Republicans kind of reestablish power through Harding, Coolidge, Hoover. But Hoover's the president when the economy collapses, when the Great Depression starts. I don't care who you are. If the economy's bad, you're going to lose. Right? That's still true today. If the economy's good, the incumbent's most likely going to win. Right? Hoover wins. So what was his saying? A chicken in every pot and a car in every driveway. It was more than just the chicken in every pot piece. But you can see he has faith in this consumer economy idea. Yeah, advertising. I think we talked about enough of that. Even still today, what do advertisers use? They use emotion, right? Exploit anxieties, right? You need deodorant. Sex sells. Good-looking people on both sides help sell things, right? And it's still used. It's evolved, but it's still used today. So advertising really starts to develop. And then we talked about this too, the supercharging of buy now, pay later. And the foot stomp on this is most everyone's buying into this idea. Some people did it out of necessity, like farmers, because their equipment is so expensive that they had to buy now and pay it off, just like you would think of like a car today. And so with that, our debt level on the consumer side is rising very quickly, and it's getting dangerous. And one of the things people are buying on credit is stock. And so the stock market is going up and up and up, and people are borrowing money to buy stock in the stock market. And I'll try to explain that a little bit better here in a second. And those blue stars are some commercials I used. You can probably skip them. You know how advertising works. One of the things that also develops that's still with us today, and you know, really useful, chain stores. Sears was one of the most successful for a long time. You could buy almost anything, to include a house. You could buy a house in the Sears catalog, and they'd ship you the cement and the concrete and the wood. No joke. Supermarkets also, you know, for food come up. But there's a limit to this. There's only so much credit that can go out there. And if you're putting out credit on a thing called margin, let's say I put down 10%. And that means I need 90% of the rest from the bank to pay for whatever it is, to include stock. So that can't go on forever. And especially if the market's going up and up and up, and all of a sudden it goes down, now we're going to get into crunch time. And that's what happens, is the market collapses. And it's not the only reason, but it's a substantial, maybe the catalyst or the straw that broke the camel's back, that pushes us into the Great Depression. Yeah, the farmers are kind of left out. They're just struggling along. And we still see these elements, social Darwinism, that idea if you're rich, you're good, you're a good person. If you're poor, there's something wrong with you. And people are starting to get interested in this get rich quick. And the stock market becomes this get rich quick idea, that I can get in, get out, make some money. This is one of the first Piggly Wigglies. It's an interesting picture, isn't it? Couple things to notice when we talk about this in class. One, there's a turnstile. It's not very big, is it? It's like you walk down, up, and you check out over here. But notice this. This was your shopping basket at the time. So if I want to get people to buy more, there's a couple things I need to do. I need to expand. I need to make the stores bigger. And I need to make it easier for them to lug all this stuff, either home or out to the car or whatever it is. So both of those happen. And you see the evolution of the shopping basket. This was the first shopping cart. You see one that looks just like that still today. So no more of this, right? Lugging your bloody groceries around. And so what comes next is, I mean, you see carts get bigger and all. But what's going on today is this. You have almost a GPS base. You can email or plug in your shopping list. It'll tell you where it's at in the store. And you know what they always do is put the most popular items at the very back of the store, so that you have to walk all the way to the back to get what it is you're going to get. And that way you look around and go, ooh, I need that. Ooh, I need that. And then this is still evolving. I've heard of on phones now, you can download apps for either different products or stores, and they have readers in the store that if they pick up that your phone is on and has that app, it'll in real time lower the price of what it is that, you know, say it's a Clorox app. All of a sudden now that Clorox bottle is cheaper than just the average Joe that doesn't have the app. And so what's the next step? And this is ongoing as well, is that, right? Order from Amazon, the drone drops it off on your front porch that day. Eesh. Okay. How quick do we need stuff? Here's another piece to the growing kind of cloud of depression. It's called the Dawes Plan, and it's not a good one, but you can read through it. Remember, the Treaty of Versailles specified that Germany, one, was to blame for the war. Thus, they had to make reparations. They had to pay for all this death and destruction. And so primarily they're paying back Britain and France. But let me just show you the picture. It makes it's easy to explain. So here's Germany. Huge reparation debt. There's no way they can repay it. So they do a couple things. One, they borrow money from the US. That helps, but it's not enough. And so they crank up the printing press. And by doing that, they devalue the value of the Deutschmark to the point that it becomes worthless. It's hyperinflation. But you can see this cycle. It's like all that's going on is money's moving in a circle. It's not really helping anything. So Germany's repaying to the Entente countries, who's repaying the debt that they owe us for selling them goods early in the war when we weren't fighting, but we were still helping with beans and bullets, and then us loaning money to Germany. So really the only thing that happens is bankers make some money off of interest and the like, but that's it. And this is going on. You can see how this brings in more of a global flavor, that it's not just the United States when the world's economy starts to collapse. And so here's spend a few minutes on the idea of the stock market collapse. This is a generic chart of what happens in a boom bust or a bubble cycle. And what you can do is you can put the Great Depression over this chart. You can put the dot-com bubble at the end of the 1990s, early 2000s. You can put the mortgage meltdown. And if we have another economic sell-off, you can put it over there, I guarantee it. So what happens is early on, people that are savvy, that are studying the market, that understand what's going on, they're the first ones to get in on this. And oftentimes you get this little dip where maybe that's not going to be the greatest thing. Like Amazon. I mean, for the longest time, Amazon was just flat. They hadn't made any money. But now it starts to gather some attention. And when that happens, the average Joe starts going, that looks like a good bet. And you see people starting to jump in. And now they start getting greedy. And now they look at this company and they're like, man, this is the best thing ever. It's never going to go down. If you ever hear that, run. Because everything goes down. There's ups and downs and everything. And so what happens is the market gets so inflated that right there the bubble pops. And you get a little root right here where people are like, it's not so bad. It's going to come back. And they'll try to jump back in. And then you get the catastrophic meltdown. And this is exactly what happens in the Great Depression with the market. And it's kind of sick. They call it a dead cat bounce right here. Now what happens, you can see how this goes way up, way down. But if we draw that average line, it's still average going up. So what happens? If I bought stock here in company X and then sold it up here, yeah, I've made some money on it. But if I buy it up here at the top and it starts going down, I'm like, it'll come back. And I hang on to it, and now I may not have a choice. I may have to sell it. Or the company may go out of business. And now I lose. If I can hang on to it and I bought it back here, it's gone up even after that bubble pops. So the point of this is, if you ever invest in the stock market, when it goes up, if you sell it, you make money. If it goes up and you don't, yeah, you've made money on paper. And the same with going down. If it starts going down but you don't sell it, you haven't locked in any losses. It may come back. It depends on the company. It's when you sell down here that now you've locked in those losses. And the reason you might have to sell is because the bank comes calling that, hey, buddy, we lent you 90% of the money you spent on buying these stocks. Pay us back now. And if you don't, you go bankrupt. And if a bunch of people don't, the bank goes bankrupt. Right. We'll talk about that in a minute. So, kind of a long explanation. But here's your Dow Jones, the average of 30 industrial stocks. It's just an average. It's one economic measure. But if you look at this chart, doesn't that look like almost exactly the generic boom bust? Up, 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 out of control, right? Almost straight up, and then collapse. The Black Tuesdays, Thursdays, etc. A little bounce and then down. And so the text says that we recovered by the end of the 30s. I disagree. I think it took until the early mid-50s for the economy to come back to what it was, even not at the very peak, but here. So it's a little blurry, but that's like 1953. So it took a long time to recover from this. So the New Deal, did it help? Perhaps. Did build up and converting to a wartime economy help? Yes, some. But notice, the real climb out of this hole doesn't happen until after the war's over. And that's because of the level of destruction in Europe, in Japan, not in the United States. Again, a market for all of our goods. So our economy in the 50s and 60s is just rocketing along. All right, this is the dot-com bubble, just to illustrate, same idea, same kind of chart. People jumping in, get rich quick, pop, it breaks. The bubble pops. Same thing with the mortgage meltdown. There it is. When everybody's investing in something, it's probably too late. So that fails. And in this case, it's the stock market. So you get the stock market crash, and you get, ups and downs. It's unstable, and then it starts that consistently downward trajectory. And the blue star on this one, I believe, is just an explanation of that and how it affects. So all these different pieces that were involved, kind of an overfocus on a consumer economy, the Dawes plan, get rich quicks, not just in the stock market, but in other places, that we set ourselves up. And so when the market crashes, that pushes the country into economic depression. So I think you can say it accelerates. That's a good way of putting it. It's not the only cause, but it's a big one, and maybe the most important. Okay? And so you can see those are the other elements I was talking about. And so here's the thing. When the bank says, hey, pal, whatever, it doesn't matter. Was it stock? Was it for a tractor? Whatever the money was loaned for, we need that money back, and you don't have it, right? They'll come take the tractor, kick you out of your house. But if enough people in that bank do that, now the bank's at risk of going out of business. And I didn't even talk about the Dust Bowl, but I got a picture of it here. Okay, so middle class loses savings, banks close. That's kind of the process involved here. And so you get this. It's called a run on the bank. And the reason people are running to the bank is because, let's say that's SunTrust right there. If I don't get there and get my money before SunTrust's vault is empty, I am out of luck. This is before a thing called the FDIC, right? That was part of the New Deal. Part of the outcome of the Great Depression was insurance on your money in the bank. In this period of time, if I don't get there in time, the bank closes the doors, says we're out of money, we're out of business. Guess what? You are screwed. Your money's gone. You think that would make people angry? You bet. So moving into the New Deal and FDR, he uses a term called the forgotten man. And it comes from a speech that he gave. And what he's talking about is rebuilding the economy, not in a Mellon type of way, not in a trickle-down, top-down, but to go from the bottom up. Put our faith once more in the forgotten man at the bottom of the economic pyramid. And why does that make sense? Because if in a consumer cycle, if I can put some oomph into getting people more jobs, remember how that would boost the cycle upwards. So trickle down doesn't do enough. There's not enough super rich to affect that. But there's a lot of middle class and poor folks, and they're going to spend their money on stuff that they need in that consumer cycle. Guess what? Same's true today. That's why Trump's tax cuts, in my opinion, were idiotic. Yeah, you can cut taxes on billionaires, but that's not going to improve the economic cycle. You want to help folks, cut the taxes on the lower income part of the spectrum, because they spend 90 to 100% of the money they make in that consumer cycle. And I just answered that, right? This trickle-down idea, that was Mellon's. So here's kind of a picture of what we could call the forgotten man. During the depths of the Depression, 25% unemployment. A quarter of the country was out of work. And so you can see this guy, 3 trades, 3 languages, fought in the war, 3 children, no work, just want one job. Highly qualified, a veteran, unable to find work. And he wasn't alone. And sometimes the work that people were able to find was menial, right? Just enough to scrape by at best. And so we see the failure of this old order because they don't really understand perhaps the power of a consumer economy. So we see job losses, less money, less consumption, less production, and that downward, as opposed to, it's not a reverse, but a downward cycle. Just some pieces of, and I mentioned this, the Texas 39, I think it goes into the 50s. Of course it's jarring to the country. We thought we were, we were just help the Allies, the Entente, uh, defeat Germany and Austria-Hungary. Well, we go through the Roaring Twenties where things are great, and all of a sudden, wham, we hit an economic wall, basically. 25%, right? 200 banks a month fail. So what does that do to the people that had money in those banks? There's that kind of cascading effect going on. And so people lose their house, their homes, their farms, their businesses. Now what? How do you even meet your basic needs, that Maslow's food, water, shelter, if I have nothing? Yeah. Charitable organizations try to help, but the demand is just too big. So I'll show you a picture of both of these Hoovervilles. Right, if I'm kicked out of my house, I got to keep the rain off of my head. So they build these kind of shanty towns that end up being named Hoovervilles after Herbert Hoover, the president. Desertion, divorce, suicide, alcoholism, all these things that associate with depression. We're kind of seeing the same thing now with the COVID crisis, honestly. And then throw in the Dust Bowl on the farmer's side. So here, I use this in class, throw up a picture of, you see people waiting for, this is probably a food line, it might be a job line to apply for. You can see there's a few police, right, a little law and order on this is probably, what's the hole? I think it's because there's a driveway there, some in and out, that they have to leave a gap. But I asked the question of, can you imagine if we were in a state of depression like we were in the 1930s today, would our current American culture look anything like this? Or would we be stepping on that person in front of us to get to that case of water that we want, that we need? Okay? So you can see that orderliness really strikes me. That things are really bad, but people act like they're kind of all in it together. Right? There's your classic Dust Bowl. Climatology and kind of slash and burn agricultural methods weren't sound, and so you get this drought period that blows away the topsoil. It was the Grapes of Wrath, right, by Steinbeck. And here's your picture of Hooverville. This one, if I recall, I think this is on the corner of Central Park in New York. We're going to see another one here in a minute, and Hoover's response to Hoovervilles. And it wasn't because he didn't like the name. He probably did. But not enough customers. If we go back to that economic cycle, it's understandable why. It's not like the country's completely falling apart. The factories haven't burned to the ground. There's just not any money for people to buy stuff. So you have massive underconsumption. Of course, the president is going to have to take some of the blame. And he does. But his response to it is inadequate. Let's just put it that way. Cut some consumer taxes. Great. But does that really help? If I don't have a job or I don't have any money to spend, it doesn't matter. Inject some money, $500 million into public works to try to attack it, but it's too little and it's too late. And so there's a lot of resistance or dislike. It's like, dude, you're not doing nearly enough to attack. The size of the problem's here and your solution is here. Yeah, we need massive relief. But this goes back to the idea of the gospel or the social Darwinism. Hoover opposes government relief to the poor. You're like, what? Right? I can't even make food, water, shelter, and you're not going to help out? Because remember, the first and primary function of government is safety of its citizens, which can mean different things in different times. But why would he oppose the relief? Because he thought, man, we are tough. We are rugged individuals, and if you're poor and destitute, you must have done something wrong. So it goes back to that idea, that social Darwinism. Okay? If we give you money, it's going to destroy your work ethic. If I'm starving, I don't have a work ethic to begin with, pal. Okay? So, yeah, that's what we talked, the Darwinism idea. So there's some responses to this. One is this thing called a bonus army. And what it is, some of the folks, when they enlisted into the army in World War I to help fight in Europe, were given a financial incentive. And it was kind of like a savings bond where you get it and it'll come to maturity, be worth the face value in, I want to say it was like 45. I thought it was 42 to 45. There was a window. But anyhow, you can see there's a length of time that you got to sit on this bonus before it becomes worth what it's printed. Well, during the Depression, these veterans go, you know what? We don't want the full amount. Just give us half. Give us something for our service to the country. Okay? And he sees them as a security threat. So we're going to see a picture of one of the other things people kind of migrate toward, I guess you could say, is the idea of these Robin Hoods, so-called, right? The Bonnie and Clydes, the Pretty Boy Floyds. The Blue Star's a clip from Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, right? Babyface Nelson. The reason people like these folks, at least in part, is because it feels like they're sticking it to the banks. They're sticking it to the man, the people that caused this Great Depression. And you can understand why. And so that's part of that movie, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? So here's your bonus army. See, it's pretty big. Notice that sign in the front? Racine, Wisconsin. A lot of these folks walked all the way to D.C. to protest. And you can see why Hoover might see this as a security risk. So what does he do? He gets a guy named Douglas MacArthur, who we're going to hear more about in World War II. And he burns out their Hooverville. Nice. So, you know, maybe the final nail in the coffin, Hoover didn't stand a chance with the economy and the state it was in. But notice in the background, Capitol building. This is right outside the Capitol in Washington. That's not good public relations or propaganda, is it? There are a few businesses that weather the storm. One is movies, because it's escapism. And so now you have movies like a matinee and a couple features. So you can spend a good part of your day at the movie theater, which helps you escape the bleakness of your existence. The other is music and dancing, which is really a carryover from the 20s, the Charleston and dancing and the like. So records, jukeboxes. Ooh, nice typo. Depression. What are they looking for? They're looking for escape. And now if you look at this in the class, I leave it up until somebody picks up on it. But you can see here's a movie theater. Kind of looks like the Tivoli in Chattanooga. See this? As movie theaters were coming in more and more online, so was, at least for big buildings, air conditioning. So if it's July in New York City and it's hot and I want to escape, I can go watch movies all day and sit in with my polar bear at 70 degrees and be cool as well. Pretty good. There's one more piece that helps people escape, rightly or wrongly. It's drinking. Remember, up to this point, still the 18th Amendment's in effect. It's not till 1933 that is repealed. Right, so let's take a guess. Hoover's running against FDR. Who's going to win? Not Hoover, because of the Great Depression. Right, so Roosevelt promises a New Deal to the American people. I'm going to not do this trickle down. I'm going to tax a little bit more. I'm going to collect some of the cards of wealth and deal them out in a new manner for the average American. Right? Hoover has to defend his policies, which have failed. Not a lot of specifics, but one thing FDR has is this air of confidence that this guy knows what he's doing. He speaks with passion. Right? Happy Days Are Here Again, his theme song. And so it's a landslide. And so even though he doesn't have any real New Deal policies yet, he's got some ideas, but he gets some really smart, his brain trust folks together, and we're going to try some stuff. I mean, he rolls the dice on a few of these programs. Will it work? If it doesn't, okay, end it. Let's try something else. And a couple of the ones that really worked well, one's still with us today. It's called the Tennessee Valley Authority, right? The TVA. So there he is. And what I ask in class is, what do you notice? Well, one, all those microphones, right? No ABC yet. WGN, that one kind of in the middle, is a superstation out of Chicago. But radio, and Roosevelt gets it. The power of communication and using the radio. Right? The other thing you notice is every time you see him, he's either behind a podium of some kind or seated with a blanket on his lap. Because you probably know he got polio kind of later in life, in his 20s. And so he had to wear braces on his legs. And he didn't want to show weakness. Now, it may have been, you could call it vanity, I guess. but he didn't want to show weakness. So there again. And these blue stars are a couple of his speeches. And there's some famous ones, right? When he takes the his inauguration, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. He takes a mental approach. Yes, the Great Depression's economic, but there's also a big psychological aspect. If we think we can get through it, that's half the battle. So trust me, I know how to do this. And he tries to infuse that enthusiasm into the American public. And so that's a couple of them. And the last one, it's a little out of context, but it's a video of him right after the attack on Pearl Harbor, which one illustrates the braces on his legs, but shows some of his character as well. And it's one of my favorites. Yeah, in class I call this a butt kicking. You can see it's a landslide. I mean, Hoover doesn't have a chance. He's still got 15 million votes, which is kind of amazing, but landslide victory. And so now we're going to enter into the age of Roosevelt, because he's going to win 4 terms, right? 44, he doesn't, after inauguration, he lives another 6 weeks, basically. He was in very bad health at that point. But there's no amendment to the Constitution yet that says 2 terms only, right? The 22nd Amendment, I think it is. One of the things Roosevelt had going for him that maybe doesn't get talked about enough is his wife. And Eleanor Roosevelt, this lady here, she kept FDR grounded because he kind of grew up with a silver spoon in his mouth. But she was a proponent of the downtrodden, the poor, the minorities. And so she kept FDR in touch with that group. And what we're going to see happen now is the poor and minorities and folks that generally would be in the party of Lincoln, the old Republican Party, migrating toward the new Democratic Party. And so you see the two parties slowly switching places. The old Republican Party was very liberal, right? 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, free the slaves, right to vote. Ah, my God, how can it be more liberal? But now the Democratic Party is going to take more of that mantle, and they're going to pull the poor and the minorities toward their party. And she is a big part of it. Really smart lady. Okay, so FDR, where do you attack this problem? All right, we know what the consumer economy is. I could maybe, let me just put them up there. I don't know why I did it that way. I could try to infuse some money, right? And that's been done. W. Bush did it, $600 or a bonus check during the mortgage meltdown. Trump did it. A stimulus check, $600, $1,200. I mean, that does help. Not to undermine it. Putting money, infusing money in helps, but it's very finite, and it's not going to last very long. And most people that got the stimulus check for the COVID either paid off debt or put it in the bank. So that's not helping this at all. They're not going out and buying stuff with it. They're saving it. So FDR, yes, maybe I can up consumption by the government buying some things, but that really wasn't part of the plan back then. So he wants to go here. And let's start attacking it with jobs. And again, if I get more jobs, start having people with some more money in their pockets, you can see how that can slowly bring this back to life. So that's what he tries. And his New Deal programs are really built on more jobs when you look at them. Okay? And I'm going to go through that really fast because it's alphabet soup, and most of the time it just doesn't. The overall idea is to try to impact that economy piece. Do I care what the National Recovery Act or the Works Program Administration or what all these different agencies, they were bent on trying to restart the economy. Okay, so what is he really saying? Look, our country's in okay shape. We're not falling apart. We've got to attack that under consumption, and the most important piece to that is getting people jobs, because one, jobs do make some money, but jobs also, with him talking about confidence, affect you upstairs. Having a job makes you feel like you're part of the solution, part of working the country out of depression. Okay? So the bootstrap idea, it sort of does still apply. Yep, talked about any other ideas, talked about those, the idea of incentive checks, things like that. What's the key to the New Deal? Is it something less tangible than money? And that idea, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, that it's psychological, that it's confidence. And he's sort of on the right track, but there are limitations. I don't care how confident or how let's go get them you are. You've got to attack the economic side as well. So here's the New Deal, kind of boiled down, a New Deal for America. Again, notice he goes back to the idea of the forgotten man and woman, forgotten in political philosophies. I pledge myself to a New Deal. What is that? A better share in the distribution of national wealth, more equitable opportunity, and a more equal share. We might be due for that again, because our wealth inequality has grown worse than it's ever been today. So that's the New Deal. Right? Sound familiar? A lot of people say that. A little bit about FDR. We're to the hour mark. Let me try to speed up just a little bit. There's not too much left. Light intellectually, I don't know. He was a great communicator. I think he was relatively intelligent. His wife, probably smarter than he was, and he used her, which was wise. Gives hope, right? And he's decisive. So he gets inaugurated. The first thing he does once he's in the White House, bam, bank holiday. We're going to shut down the banks for a day. Did that do anything? Because they're going to open again tomorrow. Not really. But what it did do is show this guy's in charge and he's going to make decisions. So that decisiveness, it was more, again, up here mental. And he surrounds himself with these talented folks, right? We're going to try some things. If it doesn't work, so be it. Okay? Eleanor talked about, man, top advisor, he listened to her as well he should. And a champion of the forgotten, which is part of all of his speeches. Pushing more to do more for the unemployed, more for minorities. And you see black voters moving to the Democratic Party, which, 40 years before would have never happened because the Democratic Party was still a shadow of the white slave-owning Southern Democrats of the Civil War era. Oh, I duplicated that. Just take a look. There's this is what I call alphabet soup. These are all the different things that Roosevelt plugs in. Some last the whole time, like the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. Some get repealed. The National Recovery Act is determined to be unconstitutional. We plug in Social Security, which is still with us today, and he's reelected for a second term. The other thing Roosevelt tried to do is what's being discussed, at least, and I think is a bad idea, is this packing of the Supreme Court. You may have heard that, right? That if Biden wins, the Democrats are going to try to pack the Supreme Court to redress the 6-3 conservative liberal balance. FDR tried to pack the Supreme Court. That means putting more people. Instead of 9, let's make it 15. And put people that agreed with his New Deal plans. And it backfired. Now, it didn't almost cost him re-election, but it did not go over very well. And he finally backs off of it. Right? We'll see what happens if Biden wins, if they're going to follow through on packing the Supreme Court. I think there's a lot of political fallout if they do that, but that's my opinion. And so with Roosevelt, what becomes kind of the litmus test of new presidents is this first 100 days. And so things are bad. I'm going to bank holiday, first day, do something decisive. Did it do anything overall? No, but it showed he was in charge. And so he starts attacking these issues. This Glass-Steagall Act. We're going to separate investment Wall Street banks from commercial where you deposit your money and write checks banks so that one collapsing doesn't bring down the whole system. And guess what? That worked, and it was in place up and through the 1990s before Bill Clinton started chipping away at it, and it went away just in time for the mortgage meltdown. And so there's talk today of putting it back into effect because the collapse of the investment banks in 2006 and 2007 almost killed our economy. Again, right? It's like we don't learn our lesson. And so the 100 days becomes kind of your measure of presidents. And why? Part of it is it's a honeymoon, if you will, that the new president coming in, even if the Congress is the other party or maybe just divided like it is now, Democrat House, Republican Senate, we'll see if that changes. But even in this case, the Republicans are willing to give FDR some latitude. Let's see what this guy can do. So you get kind of this honeymoon effect in the first 100 days. So that's why you see new presidents. If Biden gets elected, he's going to push his campaign objectives hard early on because that honeymoon, hell, we'll see how long it even lasts anymore. We're so polarized. But anyhow, yeah. Look, if you want to get more detail on this, be my guest. But it's just an illustration of all those alphabet soup agencies that are out there to try to help with jobs. The CCC is an interesting one, and I'll show you a picture and we'll talk about it. Notice, to me, this looks like an Army training, weekend, like National Guard training. What you've got is these folks here that are working for the Civilian Conservation Corps. So what do I see? They have some kind of quasi-uniform. They've got tents. They've got food at the table. So food, water, shelter, that basic need is met. And they're getting paid a little bit. And so if you're here at a CCC camp working to like rebuild a state park, you don't have a lot to spend your money on. So where's that money go? It goes back to mom and the kids. And that starts to help infuse back into the economy. So now I'm attacking it in two places, jobs and money. And the CCC went on through the early 1980s. It was pretty successful. Yeah, sometimes putting people to work is expensive. Right? Especially if the government's the one paying the salary, the wages of. And so you see some of these kind of rise and fall. The WPA, writers, actors, photographers, etc., we're going to see them in action here in just a second in the picture. This, the National Recovery Administration, National Recovery Act, it's not the NRA that you think of today, right? National Rifle Association. Yeah, there you go. Remember, they had the artists and advertisers, things like that. So this was kind of a propaganda campaign. And what they did was, you can see the lady here, she's basically got some paint. And they painted the back of these ladies in bathing suits. And so you get a tan and then wash it off, and you'd have kind of that negative image on your back for a while to promote the National Recovery Administration. All right, so some successes and failures. Nothing goes perfect. This AAA, why would we tell farmers? Why would we pay them to produce less? Because farmers were so efficient, even with the Dust Bowl, that if I have less supply, that's going to increase the cost. So it keeps prices up, as opposed to, if we put everything, all the soybeans produced on the market, it's going to collapse the price of soybeans. So we do that. Don't plant this. It still happens today, subsidizing farmers. It does drive up the prices. TBA, I would argue that's still a success. I mean, there was 3 or 4 in our class whose parents or people they know work for TVA. And the idea of electrifying the South, another "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou" video. Remember at the very end of the movie, if you've seen it, the flood part, that's based on the TVA. It's still around. Now, a lot of people think, look, man, we're making government too big, too powerful. But the New Deal did that the government needs to step in a big way to help alleviate the Depression. And it did in part, but it wasn't 100% successful. Okay, so there is opposition. And I talked about the pack in the Supreme Court. We're getting toward the finish line here. Yep. Congress says no, because the Senate's the one that approves appointment of Supreme Court justices. So they can say no, and it's not going to happen. What it did, though, is it moved the needle a little bit, where now the Supreme Court is a little more amenable to some of the New Deal programs. Okay? Legacy of. It's not just one unified thing throughout his term. So you've got the New Deal and then the second wave of the New Deal. So we're starting to initially target everybody, but then it becomes more focused on those that need it more, which kind of makes sense. So you get the shotgun blast initially, but then you look at which programs are really helping out the lower socioeconomic end of the scale and focus on those. Okay? If it's for everybody, is it the masses or the classes? FDR breaks with the classes and embraces the masses, everybody, but especially focused on the lower class. And why? The more I help out everybody, the more my chance of re-election goes up. And we see minorities moving toward the Democratic Party because blacks benefit from the New Deal. So does anybody that's in dire straits economically. So the poor, etc., and you see them switch to the Democrats. That's part of why FDR had 4 terms. He embraced the mass of the country, right? Who else would support FDR and the Democrats? The poor. I don't care what color their skin is. The poor and the downtrodden. There's a lot of money being spent. And so at some point we've got to back off, turn the faucet down a little bit. And FDR tries it, and it starts the economy back going downwards again. So really, it's war preparation, the fighting of the war, but honestly, it's the end of the war and all the destroyed markets in Europe and Japan that are open to American products that really get us out of the Depression for good. Okay? But the government's even bigger. The U in USA has become bigger and bigger. It was bigger after Lincoln and the Civil War. Now it's even bigger. The U has a bigger piece than the S, than the states. And you see this political revolution. That's really what we talked about for quite a while. The change of the Democrats and Republicans and who are supporting them. And we see the Democrats, I mean, a lot of this is FDR himself. Just that block of time where he was president. What you see today, honestly, is an alternating presidents. If we go back to Clinton, Democrat, 2 terms. W. Bush, Republican, 2 terms. Obama, Democrat, 2 terms. Trump, Republican, 1 term. That's what my tea leaves tell me. But always this back and forth. It's like, let's try this side. Oh, they're terrible. Let's try the other side. Meanwhile, in Europe, this is the last slide. Right, all this going on, all this internal focus, and again, not just the U.S., the most of the world was in some form of depression. So everybody's focused on their internals, whereas Hitler is focused on rebuilding both Germany, the psyche of Germany, and the German military, in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Right? And so this last video, this is a good one. It's Hitler speaking to the Reichstag, but it's translated, and he makes fun of FDR. And it kind of shows where his mentality is. So that leads us to the cusp of entry into World War II. Right. Oof, hour and 10 minutes. A little bit long, but that was 2 chapters worth. And hopefully, again, the slides are posted, but maybe this will just help you kind of, that little discussion piece with understanding what it is that's going on. And I'll send you the quiz probably this, I think I'll just send it this weekend to you. So that'll be quiz 4. There's not a lot left in the class, right? And we'll have to kind of email back and forth on your presentation piece, because I just told the Sneezy and Gabe just to go ahead and do theirs, and we'll let you build your own kind of singular presentation on the historical topic. We'll talk more about that here in the next week or 2, or email. All right, so I hope you found that helpful. I didn't put you to sleep, and I'll probably do the next one after chapter 28, something like that, World War II, and then the beginnings of the Cold War. All right, Abby, we missed you in class. Hopefully you see you back before the end of the semester. So long.